Good day, everyone. We're excited to present our COIL project, developed by our team from Saltillo, Mexico City, and Colombia. The team members are Héctor Emilio Padilla Ochoa, Marcela Adriana Cornejo Ramos, María Alejandra Alonso Suárez, and Santiago Rogero Moreno. Today, we will discuss the cost of capital in global markets, using Nestlé as an example to show how this concept plays out for companies with international reach. Our focus is on the capital asset pricing model, or CAPM, which helps companies calculate their cost of capital by measuring risk. Cost of capital is basically the return a company needs to earn to keep its investors happy. In calculating this, there are two ways to use CAPM: a local version, which focuses on one country's market, and a global version, which takes into account a more international perspective. We will compare these two approaches and explain why global CAPM often gives a more accurate picture for multinational companies like Nestlé. So, why is CAPM important? Well, CAPM estimates a company's cost of capital by assessing the risk investors take. The risk is a crucial part of financial planning and investment because it affects how a company is valued and the return investors expect. When looking at a company's values, analysts consider factors like its assets, expected earnings, and its mix of financial options. CAPM, along with the dividend discount model or DDM, are popular tools for these calculations, but for small economies, CAPM can be hard to apply correctly, as we'll explain. The local CAPM approach first became popular in the 1960s when the US stock market dominated. At that time, the US market was so large that focusing on it alone made sense. The US held most of the world's market capitalization, so CAPM calculations using US data could be broadly applied. But over the years, financial markets have become more open and globalized. The US stock market is now just one part of the world's capital markets, making it necessary to consider a broader approach. This is where the global CAPM comes in, especially for companies with a global presence. So, let's take a closer look at why the local CAPM doesn't work as well in smaller countries. Local CAPM can often give a less accurate view of a company's cost of capital, especially for smaller countries with limited diversification options and fewer investors. In smaller markets, the local CAPM approach tends to overestimate risk because the local market is less diverse, which can make the cost of capital appear higher than it really is. This is a challenge for multinational companies like Nestlé, which are globally integrated. The global CAPM offers a more realistic view of risk for companies like Nestlé. Nestlé operates in many countries, has revenue sources, investors from all over the world, and relies on various international markets. For a company with such global connections, the global CAPM does a better job of representing its true level of risk. Using a global CAPM approach allows for a more accurate picture of Nestlé's cost of capital, as it accounts for the influence of international markets and investor pools. To illustrate this, let's think of Nestlé's situation under both models. If we only use local CAPM, we would calculate Nestlé's cost of capital based on one country's risk factors. We could inflate the result due to the country's unique market limitations, but when we use the global CAPM, we get a balanced view that matches Nestlé's global operations, giving a more accurate result for Nestlé's investors. In today's connected financial markets, it is clear that companies like Nestlé benefit from a broader global view when it comes to measuring risk. The global CAPM reflects the reality of multinational business by aligning more closely with the international markets and capital flows that they rely on. This gives a better estimate of their true cost of capital and more stable foundation for investors and financial planning.
Hi. Here, I'll dive straightforward into the core ideas of our study on the capital asset pricing model, or CAPM. I'll keep it straightforward. This model is actually pretty relatable when you try to break it down. So, what exactly are we doing in this study? Well, imagine you're trying to risk or we're trying to measure how risky an investment is. We use two ways of looking at it: the local CAPM, which focuses only on the country's market, and the global CAPM, which looks at markets worldwide. The question is, which one gives us a clearer, more accurate picture? Turns out the global CAPM has a major edge here because it brings in factors from across the world, not just one single country. This can give investors and companies a much better sense on what cost of capital basically is and how much it really costs to take an investment risk. Let's break down some of the key elements we looked at. The risk premium calculation. The global CAPM calculates risk by factoring in the global market. This is important because it doesn't get tripped by things like exchange rates that can throw off local models. The investor assumptions. We're also working with the idea that investors want the highest return for an acceptable level of risk. The CAPM assumes that most investors are on the same page here, which helps keep things simple and consistent when modeling. Local versus the global market factors. This is where things can get tricky if you're just using a local CAPM. If a company operates globally, a local CAPM may not capture the whole story and or can overestimate the risk involved. This is especially important when calculating what's called the beta, which is a measure of how much stock moves relative to the market. In a global model, you'll get a more balanced beta because you're taking into account more factors. A case of study of Nestlé. We put this theory to the test with a practical example, looking at Nestlé, a Swiss company with a global reach. Using a local CAPM model gave an exaggerated sense of risk, while the global CAPM gave a much fairer evaluation. For a company like Nestlé, with businesses all over the world, it makes sense to use a model that captures the global trends. The home bias and portfolio diversification. Many investors stick to what's familiar, the local assets, and avoid foreign investments, which is what's called home bias. But our study suggests that with markets becoming more globally connected, looking at investments from an international angle is more consistent with how assets are priced today. Finally, with some interesting math on how these models differ, we showed that when you put the local and the global CAPMs side by side, the difference really boils down to the beta, a sort of sensitivity measure of how stock moves in the market. If this isn't calculated correctly, using a local CAPM in a global context can actually make you misjudge the risk. These equations aren't just math. It's just telling us that a local CAPM might miss key global influences, leading to mistakes in pricing risk.
Hello, my name is Marcela Cornejo. I am going to start talking about the information analysis of the case. Well, studies argues that ownership restrictions generate a higher cost of capital due to not diversifiable risk imposed on local investors. By allowing integration with the international market, Nestlé was able to lower this cost. The findings suggest that companies in smaller markets benefit from cost of capital estimation models that consider the interconnections of international markets. The case also highlights how to use of a local CAPM model that can lead to an underestimation of the cost of capital for companies with high exposure to foreign markets, because the global CAP incorporates systematic risk in a global context. It is more accurate, the tool, for valuing the cost of capital for multinational companies. This perspective reinforces the importance of adapting financing strategies to the reality of global integrated financial markets, especially in a world where barriers to investments are tending to decrease. Next, I am going to talk about the foreign investment restrictions. That is one of the central points, is how restrictions on foreign investments increase Nestlé costs of capital. Previously, Nestlé shares were divided in two types: the bearer shares, that is, which could be freely acquired by international investors, and the registered shares, that it is available only to Swiss investors. The last one, due to ownership limitation, traded like a discount compared to bearer ships. So this price difference is explained by the fact that local investors demand a high return to compensate for the non-diversified risk, while international investors can better diversify the risk and therefore willing to accept a lower required return. Well, the next I am going to talk about the effect on Nestlé market value. The market reaction after the lifting of restrictions illustrates like how financial integration reduces the cost of capital by allowing foreign investors to acquire registered shares. The price of registered shares increased significantly, while the price of bearer shares decreased, indicating like a redistribution in demand and risk perception. Well, and the elimination of these restrictions allowed foreign investors to participate in the Nestlé market and diversify the risk, which increased like the total market value.
In conclusion, the literature on valuation in the USA is extensive and nuanced, particularly concerning the capital asset pricing model and its implementation of determining the cost of capital. While the financial economists often disagree of the specifics of risk measurement, they generally accept the foundation principle that risk significantly impacts the cost of capital. In contrast, the application of CAPM in small countries is less developed, with practitioners often defaulting to local adaptations that may not reflect the increasingly globalized nature of capital markets. They propose the global CAPM as a more appropriate model for these countries, emphasizing that the cost of the capital is often driven by the global market conditions rather than the local factors. Our analytics emphasize the necessity of finance professionals to evaluate their valuations models, especially in the context of increasing globalization. The transition from a purely local CAPM to a more globally oriented CAPM could lead to a more accurate assessment of risk and the cost of capital, ultimately improving investment decision-making in an interconnected financial landscape.